Mais je m'appelle Monsieur Tommy. Ouais? Avez-vous un bonjour aujourd'hui? Ouais!
All right. Hey now.
Mr. Kovacs Class. It's Mr. Kovacs Class.
You might learn a ton.
It's Mr. Kovacs Class.
He's interesting too.
It's Mr. Kovacs Class.
And he's super cool.
It's Mr. Kovacs Class.
That's Monsieur Tommy. He is the ghost of Alexei St. Martin's stomach. Hey! Who is Alexei St. Martin, do you ask? Well, that's what we're going to answer today as we study Project Beaumont. I have written a tale of William Beaumont as a dramatic, epic poem, which I call the Ballad of William Beaumont. At this time, I will read it to you. And then in your part 2, you will go back to that poem and you will ratty a few questions. All right, friends, follow along with me as I read The Ballad of William Beaumont. This was written by Mr. Kovac a number of years ago about William Beaumont. The Ballad of William Beaumont. Listen to this tale of discovery and fate. William Beaumont's life we now celebrate. Owing to an unfortunate accident, though, he was lucky to treat Alexei St. Martin's serendipitous blow. In 1812, a nation at war, it's where our story begins. A young army surgeon became skilled at removing soldiers' limbs. By 1814, Beaumont was revered as a doctor unmatched. To the western frontier, he was promptly dispatched. One day in the woods, a tragic event had transpired. A young voyager's hunting rifle had suddenly misfired. To the doctor, he'll fix it, just keep yourself calm. But into his gut, a gaping wound the size of his palm. Alex St. Martin was barely hanging on to his life. He trusted his fate to the skilled surgeon's knife. Alas, the wound could not fully be closed. But an opportunity was there. An idea was proposed. Into the hole, different foods would be placed, tied to a string and left there for days. Oh, what mysteries St. Martin's stomach revealed. Gastric juice's secrets were no longer concealed. Beef, pork, cabbage, and bread were all tried. The end result produced a startling surprise. Carbohydrates and starches simply got stoked, but proteins, lo, the proteins, they were all revoked. Many different ways and foods had been tested. The same result each time, only the proteins were digested. Even outside the stomach, done test tube style, the gastric juice worked the same all the while. It's gastric juice that has the digestive trait. St. Martin's injured stomach had revealed that fate. Beaumont became known to all of medical history, forever hailed as the father of gastric physiology. Note, in a tragic twist, the good doctor died relatively young and unexpectedly as a result of a fall. The patient, living his life with a hole in his abdomen, lived to be an old man. He was constantly hounded by other doctors for more experiments, which he refused. When he died, his family buried his stomach separately. C'est une bonne histoire, hein? Ouais. Mais oui. Tale of a man and the good doctor. The man was Alexis St. Martin, a young French-Canadian voyager. Way. He was part of the fur trade. So his job was to go capture animals and then sell their bodies first to France, and then after the war of after the French and Indian War, then to Great Britain, and then after the War of 1812, which is when this story happens, it's now basically to the United States, to Americans. And he actually was in what we now call northern Michigan. And he was trapping, and unfortunately, he had a terrible accident where a gun discharged and shot him right in the gut. Mais oui, dans l'estomac. C'est mal. Yeah, right in the stomach. I believe they said the wound was the size of the palm of a man's hand. Now, normally at this time, that would have been a death sentence. But he was close to a fort, a military fort, where this man, Dr. William Beaumont, was stationed. And Beaumont was a really skilled surgeon. Back in the war, he never lost a patient, which was amazing. And I think now in retrospect, we know why. He was one of the few surgeons that would wash his equipment between operations. Yeah. Anyway, St. Martin was rushed to the good doctor. And the good doctor looked at this and said, well, we'll do what we can, but you're probably not going to make it. And so he tried to sew up the wound, but he couldn't do it. This wound was called a fistula. So what he did was he cauterized the edge. Cauterize means he basically burned the edges. So it left a hole, like a hole where you could actually look right into this man's stomach. Now, St. Martin, it was expected, Beaumont expected St. Martin to die within a few days, but St. Martin was a pretty tough cat, man. Mais oui, c'est tough. And he recovered. But the problem is, when you're a voyageur, now you have a hole in your stomach, you can't really go back to the job that you had. So Beaumont, I think, seized on an opportunity, right? I think he saw like, okay, this guy is giving me a look into a stomach no one's ever seen before. We know you throw food in your mouth, but we're not really sure what happens once it's inside. I mean, we haven't invented x-rays yet or any, maybe I'll at least get to see what happens in the stomach. So he came up with an agreement with the young voyageur. He gave him a new job. He goes, you're gonna be my new assistant handyman. In exchange, you will be my test subject. Now, nobody knows if St. Martin really agreed or not because his English was terrible. But nevertheless, he became a guinea pig. Like what Beaumont would do was he'd take different foods and he'd like tie them to strings and then he'd stick them in the hole in the stomach and then he'd see what happened to the food. He did carbohydrates, he did fats, he did simple carbs, he did protein-rich foods, right? He left them in there for the same amount of time. He had the same size piece. I mean, he was very, very Francesco Redi good. And then he'd pull them out and he'd see how much of the food was gone. And what he found was that if you put complex carbs, you stick them in the stomach, they just get wet. They don't get broken down by the stomach. Same with simple carbs. They don't get broken down. Fats, stomach doesn't do anything to them. The only type of food that gets broken down in the stomach were protein-rich foods. It was like the stomach had in it this juice, and the juice could take protein and break it into bits. We call that gastric juice because gastric means of the stomach. Mais oui, l'estomac. Gastric. He even tested this juice outside of the stomach. He'd have St. Martin like roll over and have some of the gastric juice ooze out into a bottle, right? He made St. Martin fast and then tested different foods. He made St. Martin stand on his head. I mean, he made St. Martin do this so many different ways. And every time it basically came out the same way, that the stomach's job was simply just to digest proteins. He wound up writing a book about it called Gastric Juice and the Physiology of Digestion, Experiments and Observations. It was a pretty big hit amongst the medical community because no one had seen the inside the stomach before. And William Beaumont became somewhat famous for doing that. Okay, so we're going to spend the next few days figuring out, well, how does it actually work? But right now you need to know that William Beaumont, the doctor, Army medical doctor, he worked on a patient. The patient had a terrible accident, but it opened up a fistula, a hole into the stomach where the first time you could observe what the stomach does. And the stomach works on proteins. When we continue this quest, we'll see what other secrets digestion reveals. And now, an interesting historical note. All right, bonus coverage. There's the good doctor, William Beaumont, when he was an older man. He actually died in his late 40s in the city of St. Louis. He spent his whole career in the U.S. Army as a surgeon. And Alexis St. Martin lived with him. But what was interesting was right around the War of 1812, he was stationed in this town, which you might recognize. There was a huge, important battle fought here during the War of 1812. And in 1814, William Beaumont was stationed here as the Army doctor. Anybody recognize that town? It's only about 12 miles away from here. If you said Plattsburgh, that is correct. Plattsburgh, New York. In fact, William Beaumont married a Platt. Plattsburgh is named after a family that settled it, and one of the descendants of that family actually wound up becoming Mrs. Beaumont. Interesting. So Beaumont's attached to Plattsburgh. In fact, if you go to like SUNY Plattsburgh, the science building is named after William Beaumont, this guy. There's also a Beaumont Labs in Plattsburgh. There's a whole bunch of things in Plattsburgh named after William Beaumont because he was a pretty important scientist who happened to figure out, there's Beaumont Hall, figure out how gastric physiology worked. All right? Interesting, I know.